140,000 men on board, and sailed for Africa. 1 or 2 years had been spent in making these preparations, which time the Carthaginians had improved in building new ships, so that, when the Romans set sail and were moving along the coast of Sicily, they came in sight of a larger Carthaginian fleet assembled to oppose them. Regulus advanced to the contest. The Carthaginian fleet was beaten as before. The ships which were not captured or destroyed made their escape in all directions, and Regulus went on without further opposition and landed his forces on the Carthaginian shore. He encamped as soon as he landed, and sent back word to the Roman Senate asking what was next to be done. The Senate, considering that the great difficulty and danger, viz., that of repulsing the Carthaginian fleet, was now past, ordered Regulus to send home nearly all the ships and a very large part of the army, and with the rest to commence his march toward Carthage. Regulus obeyed. He sent home the troops which had been ordered home, and with the rest began to advance upon the city. Just at this time, however, news came out to him that the farmer who had had the care of his land at home had died, and that his little farm, on which rested his sole reliance for the support of his family, was going to ruin. Regulus accordingly sent to the Senate, asking them to place someone else in command of the army, and allow him to resign his office, that he might go home and take care of his wife and children. The Senate sent back orders that he should go on with his campaign, and promised to provide support for his family, and to see that someone was appointed to take care of his land. This story is thought to illustrate the extreme simplicity and plainness of all the habits of life among the Romans in those days. It certainly does so, if it is true. It is, however, very extraordinary that a man who was entrusted by such a commonwealth with the command of a fleet of 130 vessels and an army of 140,000 men should have a family at home dependent for subsistence on the hired cultivation of 7 acres of land. Still, such is the story. Regulus advanced toward Carthage, conquering as he came. The Carthaginians were beaten in one field after another, and were reduced, in fact, to the last extremity, when an occurrence took place which turned the scale. This was the arrival of a large body of troops from Greece, with a Grecian general at their head. These were troops which the Carthaginians had hired to fight for them, as was the case with the rest of the army. But these were Greeks, and the Greeks were of the same race and possessed the same qualities as the Romans. The newly arrived Grecian general evinced at once such military superiority that the Carthaginians gave him the supreme command. He marshaled the army accordingly for battle. He had 100 elephants in the van. They were trained to rush forward and trample down the enemy. He had the Greek phalanx in the center, which was a close, compact body of many thousand troops, bristling with long iron-pointed spears, with which the men pressed forward, bearing everything before them. Regulus was, in a word, ready to meet Carthaginians, but he was not prepared to encounter Greeks. His army was put to flight, and he was taken prisoner. Nothing could exceed the excitement and exultation in the city when they saw Regulus and 500 other Roman soldiers brought captive in. A few days before they had been in consternation at the imminent danger of his coming in as a ruthless and vindictive conqueror. The Roman Senate were not discouraged by this disaster. They fitted out new armies, and the war went on, Regulus being kept all the time at Carthage as a close prisoner. At last the Carthaginians authorized him to go to Rome as a sort of commissioner, to propose to the Romans to exchange prisoners and make peace. They extracted from him a solemn promise that if he was unsuccessful he would return. The Romans had taken many of the Carthaginians prisoners in their naval combats, and held them captive at Rome. It is customary in such cases for the belligerent nations to make an exchange and restore the captives on both sides to their friends and home. It was such an exchange of prisoners as this which Regulus was to propose. When Regulus reached Rome, he refused to enter the city, but he appeared before the Senate without the walls, in a very humble garb, and with the most subdued and unassuming demeanor. He was no longer, he said, a Roman officer or even citizen, but a Carthaginian prisoner, and he disavowed all right to direct or even to counsel the Roman authorities in respect to the proper course to be pursued. His opinion was, however, he said, that the Romans ought not to make peace or exchange prisoners. He himself and the other Roman prisoners were old and infirm and not worth the exchange, and, moreover, they had no claim whatsoever on their country, as they could only have been made prisoners in consequence of want of courage or patriotism to die in their country's cause. He said that the Carthaginians were tired of the war, and that their resources were exhausted, and that the Romans ought to press forward in it with renewed vigor, and leave himself and the other prisoners to their fate. The Senate came very slowly and reluctantly to the conclusion to follow this advice. They, however, all earnestly joined in attempting to persuade Regulus that he was under no obligation to return to Carthage. His promise, they said, was extorted by the circumstances of the case, and was not binding. Regulus, however, insisted on keeping his faith with his enemies. He sternly refused to see his family, and, bidding the Senate farewell, he returned to Carthage. The Carthaginians, exasperated at his having interposed himself to prevent the succession of his mission, tortured him for some time in the most cruel manner, and finally put him to death. One would think that he ought to have counseled peace and an exchange of prisoners, and he ought not to have refused to see his unhappy wife and children, but it was certainly very noble of him to refuse to break his word. The war continued for some time after this, until, at length, both nations became weary of the contest, and peace was made. The following is the treaty which was signed. It shows that the advantage on the whole in this first Punic war was on the part of the Romans. There shall be peace between Rome and Carthage. The Carthaginians shall evacuate all Sicily. They shall not make war upon any allies of the Romans. They shall restore to the Romans without ransom all the prisoners which they have taken from them, and pay them within 10 years 3,200 talents of silver. The war had continued for 24 years. End of chapter 1. Recording by Hollis Hanover.